There is a particular kind of morning in early spring when the light comes through a general store window at exactly the right angle to show you everything the winter left behind. The dust on the upper shelves, the watermarks on the floorboards where the snow came under the door in January. The way the wood of the counter has dried and pulled slightly away from itself, the way wood always does after a hard season, as if the cold taught it something about the wisdom of keeping a little distance from everything around it. I have been watching those mornings for 28 years. My name is Beatrice Holt. I have owned this store in Lewistown, Montana since 1883, which means I was here before most of the families who settled Judith Basin, and I will likely be here after most of them have gone. A general store is not a glamorous institution, but a general store in a frontier community is the closest thing that community has to a memory. Everything passes through eventually: the mail, the seed, the bad news, the good news when there is any, the rumors, which travel faster than either. You came in this morning talking about innovation. You used that word twice before you finished your coffee. You said the Department of the Interior was beginning to study what you called earth-sheltered construction as an emerging technique, and that you were documenting examples across the Northern Territories for a federal report. You seemed pleased about it. You are young enough that it showed. I am 71 years old. I have watched ideas travel through this basin for nearly 3 decades. I have watched them arrive with someone's name attached, and I have watched that name disappear from them the way chalk disappears from a blackboard, gradually, and then all at once, and then there is nothing left to show it was ever there. So before you write another word in that notebook, I want to tell you about Marta Lindqvist. I want you to understand that I am not telling you this to correct you. I am telling you this because 25 years is long enough to carry something alone, and you are the first person from the government who has walked through that door with a notebook and time enough to listen. Put your pen down for a moment. Just listen. The winter of 1886 into 1887 has a name now. People who study these things call it the Big Die-Up. The cattlemen who lived through it don't call it anything, generally, because the men who most need to talk about it are the ones who lost everything in it and found that language was not adequate to that particular task. What I can tell you is what it looked like from here, from behind this counter, watching men come in for supplies with a look in their eyes I had not seen before and have not seen since. The look of people doing arithmetic that keeps coming out wrong. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand what Marta Lindqvist did in the fall of 1886, you need to understand what Judith Basin was in that year, not what it looked like. I could describe the grass and the mountains and the quality of light in September, and it would mean nothing to you. I mean what it cost. The practical accounting of life in that place at that time, because that accounting is the only thing that explains every decision anyone made that winter, including hers. A homesteader in Judith Basin in 1886 needed 3 things to survive from October to May: a structure tight enough to hold heat, fuel enough to generate it, and food enough to last until the ground thawed. Of these 3, the fuel was the most punishing. A small cabin, 1 room, family of 4, needed a minimum of 3 cords of firewood to make it through an average winter. A larger cabin, 5 or 6, you cut it yourself if you had timber on your land. You hauled it from the north if you didn't. You paid for it in money or in labor, and either way, it cost you more than you wanted to spend because it was not optional. Firewood in Judith Basin was not comfort. It was arithmetic. You ran out, you froze. The equation was that simple and that final. Harold Pike understood this better than anyone. He had been building cabins in the basin for 14 years by the fall of 1886, the only carpenter of any real skill within 40 miles, and he had built them all to the same proven formula: timber frame, board walls, shake roof, pitched steep enough for snow load, fireplace or iron stove depending on what the family could afford, 2 stories if the lumber budget allowed. Pike's cabins were not beautiful, but they were solid and they were warm. And in 14 years of Montana winters, not one of his structures had failed the people inside it. That is a record worth something. Pike knew it and the basin knew it, and when Harold Pike told you something about building in that territory, you listened. He told several people in the fall of 1886 that Marta Lindqvist was building her own grave. She had come into my store in August. This is when I first took real notice of her, though I had known her for years. She and her husband Eric had been farming their 160 acres out on the eastern reach of the basin since before I opened this store, and she came in regularly enough that I knew her face and her habits and the particular Norwegian directness of her manner, which I had always appreciated. Frontier life does not much reward indirectness, and Marta Lindqvist had never wasted a word in the 20-some years I had known her. Eric had died in the winter of 1884, inflammation of the lungs. He lasted 6 weeks after the fever came, which was longer than the doctor expected, and probably had something to do with the stubbornness that characterized everything Eric Lindqvist attempted. He was 67 years old. They had been married 41 years. After he died, their son Gunnar, he had a blacksmith shop here in town, began what I can only describe as a patient, determined, and ultimately unsuccessful campaign to bring his mother in from the land. He was not wrong to try. A woman of 62, alone on 160 acres, 4 miles from the nearest neighbor, 9 miles from town. There is a reasonable argument to be made. Gunnar made it. He made it in letters and in person, and at least once, that I know of, by purchasing a train ticket to Minnesota, where Marta's daughter lived, and presenting it to his mother along with what I imagine was a carefully prepared speech. Marta took the ticket, thanked him, and put it in her apron pocket. She planted spring wheat that April. I kept the ticket behind the counter for 6 months, in case she changed her mind. She never asked for it. I eventually used the paper to wrap a parcel of dried goods for the McAllister family. In August of 1886, Marta came in and set 3 items on the counter, a roll of birch bark. I stocked it for various uses, caulking and the like, a small quantity of dry clay powder, and a thermometer. A good one, the kind with a proper glass column. Not cheap. I asked her what she was building. She said she wasn't certain yet. She needed to measure something first. I didn't press. You learned, with Marta Lindqvist, that pressing produced nothing additional. She would tell you what she intended to tell you when she was ready to tell it, and not a moment before. She paid, wrapped her items in cloth, and walked out into the August heat. She came back 3 weeks later. By then she was entirely certain. What she had been measuring, I learned eventually, was the temperature of the earth at different depths. She had dug 3 test holes on the south-facing slope behind her land, 1 shallow, 1 middling, 1 deep, and placed her thermometer in each for 48 hours before reading it. The shallow hole tracked the air temperature. The middling hole lagged it by several days. The deep hole, nearly 6 feet down, held at 9 degrees Celsius, approximately 48 Fahrenheit. This was in August, when the surface was baking in Montana sun. In January, when the surface would be at -40, the deep hole would read the same. 9 degrees, always. Her father had told her this. This is the part I want you to write down. Not that she figured it out herself. She did not claim to have figured it out. She remembered it. Her father had built what the Norwegians call a jordkjelare, a word that translates roughly as earth cellar, on their farm in Voss when she was a girl. He had explained it to her while they worked together, the way fathers sometimes explain things to daughters, and both of them know the knowledge is passing from one hand to another for safekeeping. He had pressed his palm against the clay wall of the finished structure and said to her, in Norwegian, Jorde glemmer ikke varmen. The earth does not forget warmth. She had carried that sentence for 50 years without knowing she would need it. Then she needed it, and it was there. What she built into the south-facing slope behind her claimed that September and October was not precisely her father's jordkjelare, because she did not have her father's materials or her father's climate, and because a Montana winter is its own specific argument that requires its own specific answer. but the principle was his. The knowledge was inherited. She was not inventing, she was remembering, which is a different thing entirely and ought to be called by its right name. Harold Pike rode past her excavation in early October. He stopped. He looked for a while. Then he dismounted and walked the perimeter of what she had done, which at that point was a hole in a hillside 12 feet deep and a framework of salvaged railroad ties overhead, with the front wall of stacked field stone beginning to take shape. He ducked inside. He came out. He stood in the thin October sunlight with his hat in his hands and delivered his assessment. He was not unkind about it. I want to be fair to Harold Pike because fairness costs nothing, and he was, in his way, trying to help. He listed 7 specific reasons the structure would fail. The moisture would wick through the earth walls and freeze on the interior surface, turning the space into an icebox. The sod roof would not hold the weight of wet snow and would collapse inward. The firebox had no adequate draft, and the smoke would hang in the space like a low cloud. The ceiling height was insufficient for proper heat distribution. The drainage on a clay slope would fail in a hard rain and flood the interior. The door frame had no thermal break and would become a point of catastrophic heat loss. And the whole enterprise rested on a theory about earth temperature that, while perhaps valid in Norway, could not be assumed to hold in Montana. 7 reasons. He had given it genuine thought. Marta listened to all 7 without interrupting. When he finished, she thanked him for his time. Then she picked up her tamping tool and went back to work on the front wall. Pike stood there a moment longer. Then he put his hat back on and rode toward town. By the following Sunday, the story of the Lindqvist hole had traveled the 9 miles to Lewistown and installed itself comfortably in the conversation at the supply counter, where men who had never been within 4 miles of Marta's claim offered their opinions on its structural integrity. 2 of them made a small wager. I won't say how small, because it is not a number that reflects well on either party, on whether she would last until February. The women were quieter about it, as women generally are when the subject is another woman's judgment. But I heard what was said at the Sunday social, and I remember it, because I have always had the particular memory that attaches itself to injustice rather than to kindness. A woman whose name I will not give said, to no one in particular, "She'll be in someone's barn by Christmas." Poor thing came out here alone and never did learn to ask for help. The room shifted slightly, the way rooms do when something has been said that everyone knows is not quite right, but no one can immediately identify why. I knew why. But I was in the business of selling flour and nails and dry goods, not of correcting the record in public. I had my own form of patience. I waited. Winter was coming, and winter, in my experience, is the most efficient corrector of the record that this territory has ever produced. There are 2 kinds of knowledge in this world, and frontier life teaches you to tell them apart quickly, because your survival often depends on knowing which one you are dealing with. The first kind is knowledge you acquire. You read it in a book, or a man with experience explains it to you, or you make a mistake costly enough that the lesson brands itself onto your memory and stays there. This is good knowledge. Most of what we call education is made of it. Harold Pike's 14 years of building experience in Judith Basin was this kind of knowledge, accumulated, tested, refined, reliable within the conditions that produced it. The second kind is knowledge you inherit. It does not come to you through instruction so much as through proximity, through watching a parent's hands do something so many times that your own hands remember the motion before your mind has named it. Through a sentence said once, in the right moment, by someone who understood that certain things need to be said out loud, even if the child listening cannot yet use them. Through the particular weight of a tool, or the smell of a material, or the way a wall feels under your palm when it has been built correctly. This second kind of knowledge is harder to defend in argument. You cannot cite its sources. You cannot point to the book that contains it. When someone like Harold Pike asks you to justify it, you find that the justification lives in your body rather than in your mouth. and bodies do not give depositions. Marta Lindqvist carried 50 years of inherited knowledge into that south-facing slope in the fall of 1886. I did not understand this fully until years later when Dorothy McAllister told me what Marta had said during those long nights of the freeze when the children were sleeping and the two women sat by the firebox with nothing to do but wait out the dark. Dorothy said Marta talked about her father for a while, just once, just briefly, and that what she described was not a lesson so much as a morning. A specific morning in Voss, Norway, when she was perhaps 9 years old, and her father was finishing the interior of their jordkelleri, and he stopped what he was doing and pressed his open hand against the clay wall and held it there. He did not say, "Here is a principle of thermal physics." He was a farmer, not a physicist. He said, "Jorde glemmer ikke varmen." The earth does not forget warmth. And then he went back to work. Marta was 9 years old. She filed that sentence away in the part of memory reserved for things you do not yet understand but recognize as important. She emigrated to America at 28. She broke ground with Eric on their claim in Judith Basin. She raised children, buried a husband, watched the years compact themselves the way good soil compacts, dense and useful and unrecoverable. She did not think about the jordkelleri for decades, because she did not need to. The knowledge waited. In the summer of 1886, alone on 160 acres, with a Montana winter 8 weeks out, and no good solution presenting itself by the conventional methods, she needed it. It was there. The 3 test holes were not, as some people later assumed, an act of scientific ambition. They were an act of verification. Marta already knew what the earth held at depth, her father had told her, and her father had been a man who did not say imprecise things. But she was 63 years old, and she was about to make a decision that her son would call reckless, and her neighbors would call worse, and she wanted a number she could trust. Not a memory, a number. She dug the first hole to 30 centimeters, roughly a foot, and set the thermometer at the bottom and covered it with a flat stone and came back the following morning. The reading tracked the surface air temperature almost exactly. This told her nothing she did not expect. The second hole went to 90 centimeters, 3 feet. She covered it the same way, came back 2 mornings later. The reading lagged the surface temperature, cooler than the air on a warm day, slower to drop on a cool one. The earth at this depth was beginning to moderate. It was listening to the surface, but it was not obeying it immediately. The third hole she dug to 180 centimeters, 6 feet. This required most of a day and a good spade, and the particular stubbornness that had carried Marta Lindqvist through 40 years on the frontier. She set the thermometer, covered the hole, and left it for 48 hours. The reading was 9 degrees Celsius. She dug the hole again a week later, after 3 days of August heat that had driven the surface temperature into territory that made the cottonwoods along the creek look tired. 9 degrees. She dug it a third time in late September, after the first cold front had come through and left frost on the sage for 2 mornings running. 9 degrees. Her father had said the earth does not forget warmth. What he meant, she now understood with the precision that only a number can give you, was that the earth at depth had already averaged every summer and every winter it had ever experienced, and arrived at an answer, and intended to hold that answer regardless of what the air above it chose to do on any particular day. It was not warm. 9 degrees is not warm. But 9 degrees is not freezing, and 9 degrees is not 0, and the distance between 9 degrees and a livable interior temperature was a very different engineering problem than the distance between -45 and a livable interior temperature. She sat by the third test hole for a while after she read the thermometer. I imagine her doing this, though I was not there, and Dorothy was not there, and no one was there to see it. I imagine her sitting on the edge of that excavation in the September sun with the thermometer in her hand and doing arithmetic. Not the arithmetic of doubt, the arithmetic of confirmation. Her father had been right. The number said so. She could build. The site selected itself in a way that good sites often do when you are paying attention to the land rather than imposing a plan upon it. The south-facing slope behind her claim had three qualities that mattered. First, it faced the winter sun. Montana's winter sun is low and brief and not particularly generous, but it exists, and a wall that faces it correctly can collect something useful from it across the short days of December and January. Marta had watched the angle of the winter light on that slope for 30 years. She knew where the sun touched first in the morning and where it held longest in the afternoon. Second, the slope drained naturally. Water moved downhill, as it has always done, and the cut she was proposing to make into the hillside would sit above the natural drainage line. This was not luck. She had observed the slope in spring runoff conditions for 3 decades and knew exactly where the water went. She had already planned the drainage channels, 2 of them, angled away from the excavation site at 17 degrees. This answered Pike's drainage objection before he made it, though he did not know that when he made it. Third, and most importantly, the soil changed character at approximately 100 centimeters. Above that depth, the hillside was red-brown and crumbly. Decent agricultural soil, workable but loose. Below it, the earth shifted to a dense gray-blue clay, close packed and faintly damp to the touch, with almost no air between its particles. This clay would not wick moisture outward the way looser soil would. It would not crumble under the weight of the roof structure. It would hold its shape for decades if left undisturbed, and it would hold heat with the particular efficiency of dense materials everywhere, slowly absorbing it, slowly releasing it, long after any fire had died. She excavated to the gray-blue clay and stopped. The floor of the Jordkellerei sat at 120 centimeters below the original ground surface. The walls were the clay itself. She did not need to build them, only to cut them cleanly and let them stand. This was the first of several moments in the construction where the land did half the work, if you were willing to ask it correctly. The railroad ties were her largest procurement problem, and she solved it the way most things got solved on the frontier, through exchange. Magnus Eriksson, a Swedish homesteader whose claim sat 2 miles west, had contracted Harold Pike the previous spring for an expansion to his cabin and still owed Pike a balance he could not pay in cash. Pike, in turn, had a small inventory of salvaged ties from a railroad grading project that had come through the basin the prior year, purchased cheaply because railroad ties are heavy and inconvenient, and most people do not immediately see a use for them. Marta went to see Eriksson in mid-September. She proposed 2 weeks of harvest labor, herself, mornings and afternoons, the hard work of cutting and binding and stacking, in exchange for 12 of those ties. Eriksson said he would think about it. Marta went back the next morning and said she would give him 3 weeks if he needed to think longer. He took 2 weeks and 12 ties. She spent those weeks in his fields before her own structure was complete, which meant she was doing the heavier agricultural labor of the season while simultaneously running a construction project on her own land in whatever light remained after she walked home. I do not make this observation to generate admiration. I make it because it is accurate, and because accuracy is the only form of respect that means anything over a long stretch of time. The ties formed the ceiling support, laid across the width of the excavation at 60-centimeter intervals, heavy enough to bear the sod load without deflection, treated enough to resist the moisture that would inevitably press down from above. She notched them into the side walls with a precision that surprised Dorothy McAllister when she later examined the work. Like a cabinet, Dorothy told me, not like a hole in a hill. The front wall was fieldstone, mortared with clay she mixed herself from the gray-blue subsoil, and a small quantity of the dry clay powder she had bought from me in August. She had watched Eric build with clay mortar for 30 years and had worked beside him for enough of those years that her hands remembered the correct consistency without measuring, wet enough to flow into the joints, dry enough to hold its shape while it cured. She built the wall in courses, each one set back to dry before the next was laid, which meant the front wall took 11 days to complete and required more patience than any other phase of the construction. Into that front wall she set 2 doors. This was the detail that confused people most when they heard about it later. Why 2 doors when one was standard, when one was all anyone else used, when a second door meant additional cold exposure every time it was opened? It meant the opposite. The vestibule between the 2 doors, perhaps 60 centimeters of dead air space, enclosed, unheated, acted as a buffer. When Marta opened the outer door to bring in wood or water, she stepped into the vestibule and pulled the outer door shut behind her before opening the inner door into the living space. The cold air never reached the interior directly. It was interrupted. It was held at the threshold and asked to wait. Every other cabin in Judith Basin lost 8 to 10 degrees of interior temperature each time its single door opened in hard cold. Marta's interior was unmoved by her comings and goings. Pike had listed inadequate thermal protection at the entry as his 6th objection. He had not seen the second door when he made his inspection because the second door frame was not yet installed. He had assumed what he expected to find. She had learned, from a long life in communities that made assumptions about her, to let assumptions go uncorrected until they became expensive enough to reconsider. The firebox took 3 days, and I think those 3 days may be the part of the construction that tells you most about how Marta Lindqvist thought. She could have built a standard firebox, clay brick, iron door, simple flue. She had the materials. She had the skill. Eric had taught her the basic masonry, and basic masonry is what most people would have used. Instead, she spent half a day selecting granite stones from the creek bed. Not any granite. Specific stones. Dense, dark, without visible fractures, roughly fist-sized to forearm-sized, the kind that ring rather than thud when you tap them with a knuckle. She filled 2 large sacks, carried them up the slope, and set them aside. Then she built the firebox dry. No mortar. Each stone placed by weight and friction and the careful geometry of its relationship to the stones around it, the way her father had built in Norway, because Norwegian winters teach you that mortar cracks and stone held by its own mass does not. The granite was the reason. Granite holds heat. Not the way clay holds it, not the way iron holds it, the way a body holds it. Dense and slow and reluctant to release it. A granite firebox, properly sized, absorbs the heat of a fire for several hours and then continues radiating that heat for 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours after the last ember has gone cold. It is not a stove. It is closer to a battery. You charge it with fire and it pays you back across the night. Her firebox would not need to burn continuously. It would need to burn thoroughly, at intervals, and the granite would do the work between firings. This was the calculation her father's knowledge made possible. Not fighting the cold with constant fire, but storing heat in the materials around her and letting the materials do the work while the fire rested. The earth at 9 degrees, the dense clay walls, the granite firebox, 3 separate thermal masses, each doing its part, each compensating for the others, none of them requiring continuous fuel to function. She lit a test fire in the completed firebox on the last day of October, sat in the finished space, 12 feet deep, 14 feet wide, ceiling low enough to force a slight bow of the head near the entrance, and waited. The firebox burned for 2 hours, then she let it die. She put her hand against the back wall. The gray-blue clay was warm to the touch, not hot, warm, steady. The way a hand is warm, the way ground is warm in August 6 inches below the surface, 9 degrees becoming 12, 12 becoming 14. Outside, the first real cold of the season was pressing down from the north. She could hear it in the way the wind moved over the sod roof, a lower sound than wind on shingles, more muffled, as if the earth above her was absorbing that too, taking it in and quieting it. She made coffee. She read from her Norwegian Bible by tallow light. She wrote a single line in her notebook, in Norwegian, which I cannot read, but which Dorothy later translated for me. Far hadde rett. Father was right. There is a quality of light in Judith Basin in late October that I have never been able to adequately describe to anyone who has not seen it. It is not the warm gold of September, which is genuinely beautiful and genuinely false. September in Montana flatters the land the way a good portrait flatters a face, emphasizing what is best and softening everything else. October light is different. It is lower, thinner, and perfectly honest. It shows you the land as it actually is, stripped of summer's generosity, and what it shows you, if you are paying attention, is exactly how much work remains before the cold arrives and work becomes impossible. Marta Lindqvist was paying attention. She had been paying attention to that particular light for 30 years. What it showed her in the third week of October 1886 was that she had perhaps 3 weeks of workable weather remaining, a sod roof still 2 layers short of completion, a drainage channel on the eastern side that needed another foot of depth, and a door frame that had developed a slight warp from a week of alternating wet and dry conditions that would need to be shimmied and reset before the inner door would hang true. She made a list. She ordered the items on it by urgency. Then she went to work. The sod itself was harder than she had anticipated, not in the cutting. She had a good half-moon spade and 30 years of practice reading soil, but in the carrying. Each block of sod she cut from the hillside above the excavation ran to approximately 25 kilograms, which is not a trivial weight for any person, and is a considerable weight for a woman of 63 whose back had been explaining its objections to her since August. She cut the blocks in the morning, when her hands were steady, and moved them in the afternoon, when the day's work had loosened what needed loosening, and she could manage the load without bracing against pain on every step. The 5 layers went down in sequence, and each one served a purpose distinct from the others. The first layer was living sod, grass roots intact, pressed directly onto a base of woven willow branches that Marta had spent 2 evenings cutting and laying across the railroad ties. The willow absorbed moisture from above without transmitting it directly to the ties, buying them years of additional life. The second layer was rye straw, cut from her own field that August and dried through September under a canvas she had weighted with stones. She packed it to a density that required both hands and the full weight of her upper body, working it into a mat that had no significant air pockets, because air pockets in an insulating layer are not insulation. They are merely the promise of insulation, which is a different thing and worth considerably less in January. The third layer was dry earth, sifted through a screen she had made from salvaged hardware cloth nailed to a frame of scrap lumber, sifted earth packs evenly. Unsifted earth packs in clumps with voids between them, and voids are where the cold finds its way in, the same way water finds the one gap in a dam and makes it larger. She sifted 300 kilograms of earth, which took the better part of 2 days, and left her hands raw in a way that the work of digging had not. The fourth layer was the birch bark. She had bought more than people thought she needed, 3 full rolls, and she unrolled it in overlapping courses the way a proper roofer laps his shingles, each sheet covering the upper edge of the one below it so that any moisture moving downward through the sod above would meet birch bark and be redirected sideways and off the edge rather than through. Her father had used birch bark the same way. In Norway they called it gjerrabork when it was the treated variety, though hers was untreated, raw birch bark, which is naturally resistant to moisture absorption in a way that has nothing to do with treatment and everything to do with what a birch tree requires of its own skin simply to survive a Scandinavian winter. She had explained this to no one. There was no one to explain it to, and it would not have changed the work either way. The fifth and final layer was living sod again, cut from a different section of the hillside, where the grass-root structure was particularly dense and interlocked, so that the top surface of the roof would knit itself together over the course of one growing season into something close to solid. She had seen her father's jordkelleri from the outside many times as a girl, and by the time she was 12, the roof of it was indistinguishable from the hillside around it. Grass grew on it in summer. Snow settled on it in winter. It looked like land because it was land, organized to a purpose. When the fifth layer was tamped and settled, Marta stood at the base of the slope and looked at what she had built. From the outside, the jordkelleri presented a stone front wall 4 feet high, pierced by a low door and one small window set deliberately high and centered, positioned to catch the low winter sun at its most useful angle, approximately 40 degrees above the southern horizon at the solstice, which she had calculated by observing where the light fell on that wall on the 21st of December the previous year, before she had decided to build, when she was still only watching and thinking. The roof was invisible. It was the hill. Dorothy McAllister came on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of October. I know it was a Thursday because she had been at my store that morning buying salt and a new tin of baking powder, and she mentioned she intended to ride out to see what Marta was building, and I told her to give Marta my regards, and she said she would. She was matter-of-fact about it in a way that I found interesting, because most of the other women in the basin who discussed Marta's project discussed it with a particular careful pity that revealed more about the speaker than the subject. Dorothy McAllister was not a woman who led with pity. She had 5 children, the youngest not yet 2, and a husband who was a decent man and a hard worker, and not, in my observation, someone who spent a great deal of time worrying about logistics that he considered his wife's department. Dorothy worried about logistics constantly and quietly, and with a competence that I have always thought deserved more recognition than it received. She came to look at Marta's jordkelleri because she was doing her own arithmetic about the coming winter, and she wanted to understand every option available to her. What she found was Marta on the roof, or rather, on what would become the roof, still tamping the 5th sod layer with a broad, flat stone lashed to a wooden handle, working in a grid pattern from the ridge line outward. Dorothy stood at the base of the slope and watched for a while. Then she climbed up. She did not ask if she could help. She picked up the second tamping tool. Marta had made 2, because she had planned from the beginning that the 5th layer would go faster with a second pair of hands, and had simply not yet found the second pair, and began working the section Marta had not yet reached. They worked without much conversation until the light failed. When the last section was tamped to Marta's satisfaction, they sat on the ridge of the finished roof in the early dark, and Marta made 2 observations about the construction that Dorothy later relayed to me with the careful accuracy of someone who had understood she was being taught something and had paid accordingly close attention. The first was about the angle of the south wall. It was not perfectly vertical, but leaned very slightly outward at the top, perhaps 3 degrees. This was deliberate. A wall that leans slightly toward the winter sun presents more of its face to the light at the low angle of December and January, increasing the solar absorption by a small but meaningful amount across the short days of that season. The second was about where she had placed the window, high and small and south-facing. High, so that the winter light, coming in at a low angle, would strike the back wall of the interior rather than the floor. The back wall was gray-blue clay. It would absorb that light across the day and return it as warmth across the night. Small because glass loses heat, and every square inch of glass is a square inch that is not clay or stone or earth. And this was a structure whose entire logic depended on minimizing the surfaces through which warmth could escape. Dorothy told me later that she sat on that roof in the October dark and felt something shift in the way she was thinking about the coming winter. Not a decision. Not yet. Just a shift. The feeling of a problem you had assumed was fixed, turning slightly in your hands and showing you an edge you had not seen before. She rode home in the dark. She did not tell her husband where she had been. Gunnar Lindqvist came in late October. He had heard, everyone in Lewistown had heard, and what he had heard had frightened him in the specific way that news about a parent frightens an adult child, not as an abstraction, but as a physical weight, settled somewhere between the sternum and the stomach, that did not lift when he went to sleep, and was there again in the morning when he woke. He wrote out on a Sunday, "Beatrice, I am speaking of myself now in the third person, which is a habit I have developed when the memory is one I was not entirely comfortable with at the time I saw him leave from my upstairs window, which faces the south road. He had that particular set to his shoulders that men get when they are going somewhere they have already argued about and lost and intend to argue about again. He was gone most of the day. What happened between them I know only in outline, from what Gunnar said when he came back through town that evening, stopping in to buy tobacco he did not especially need, which is what men do when they want to say something and have not yet decided how much of it to say. He said she had shown him the structure. He said it was more finished than he expected. He said the interior was warmer than he expected, which he mentioned in a tone that suggested he found this detail more troubling, not less, because it made it harder to argue. He said he had raised concerns about the chimney, the flue specifically, which was improvised from salvaged tin and, in his professional opinion as a man who worked daily with metal and heat, was not an adequate solution for sustained winter use. He said his mother had listened to his concerns about the chimney with the expression she wore when she was listening to something she had already addressed. He said he had eventually asked her directly whether the flue would hold, and she had said, "I will watch it. If it needs changing, I will change it." He said he told her to come with him to Lewistown. He said she poured him coffee and did not answer for a long time. Then she said, "Come back in April." He looked at me across the counter. He was 34 years old, and he looked older than that in that moment, in the way that people look older than they are when they are afraid and have no useful action to take. He said, "She is going to freeze out there, Beatrice." I sold him his tobacco. I said, "She has been wintering on that land for 30 years, Gunnar." It was not a comfort exactly. It was only true. He rode back toward town in the last of the light. November came in quietly and then stopped being quiet. The first indication was the birds. The sandhill cranes that typically moved through Judith Basin in late October had come through 3 weeks early, flying low and fast without their usual circling, as if they had somewhere specific to be and were not inclined to delay. The meadowlarks disappeared entirely by the first week of November, which was not right. I had been watching birds from that upstairs window for years, and I could not recall the meadowlarks leaving before the third week of November in any previous year. The second indication was the cattle. Those of us in town did not observe this directly, but the ranchers who came in for supplies through October and early November reported it consistently enough that it became a kind of low, steady note in the conversation at my counter. The cattle were growing their winter coats at a rate and density that the older hands called unusual. One rancher, a man named Calloway, who had been running cattle in the basin for 18 years, came in the first week of November and bought 2 additional cords of firewood on top of his standard order. When I asked him why, he looked at me with an expression that was entirely without drama and said, "The cattle know something." I ordered additional supplies from the Helena wholesaler that afternoon, dried goods primarily, things that would keep. The third indication was the creek. By the second week of November, ice was forming at the edges of Arrow Creek in the mornings, thin, transparent, gone by noon, but there each morning and slightly thicker than the morning before. I had a habit of noting the first creek ice in my daybook each year. In the 12 years I had been keeping that record, the first creek ice had never appeared before the 17th of November. In 1886, it appeared on the 3rd. Harold Pike came in on the 12th of November for a bolt of oiled canvas and some additional nails. He was weatherproofing his window frames, a thing he did every year, standard practice. As he was leaving, he paused at the door and looked at the sky for a moment in the particular way that men who have spent many years outdoors look at a sky when the sky is telling them something they would prefer not to hear. He said, not quite to me, not quite to himself, "Going to be a hard one." Then he left. I went to the window after he had gone and looked at the sky myself. It was the color that Montana sky gets in November sometimes. Not gray exactly, but a white that has forgotten it was ever blue, flat, and close, and carrying something. The cottonwoods along the creek were bare and still. The air had that quality that cold air has when it is gathering itself, dry and thin and faintly metallic at the back of the throat, the way a well pump handle feels in December before you've touched it. I stood at that window for a while. Out on the eastern reach of the basin, 4 miles from where I stood, Marta Lindqvist was in her finished jordkellera. The roof was the hill. The fire in the granite firebox was banked low, doing its slow work. The gray-blue clay walls were holding what they held. The cold was coming. I did not know yet how cold. None of us did. We would know soon enough. The cold arrived on the 14th of December and did not leave until the 24th of January. I am going to give you those dates plainly, without ornament, because they are the frame inside which everything else happened, and frames matter. 41 days, not a blizzard, not a single dramatic event that arrived and passed and left wreckage behind it. A duration, a sustained, unrelenting cold that settled over Judith Basin the way a stone settles onto the bottom of a creek, without announcement, without particular violence, and with every intention of staying. The thermometer outside my store door read -23 °C on the morning of December 15th. By the 18th, it read -31. By the 26th, the last day of the year that I would call merely very cold before it became something with no comfortable name, it read -38. On the 3rd of January, it dropped to -45 and held there for 11 consecutive days, broken only by brief, false moderations of a few degrees that felt like mercy and were not. I kept records. I have always kept records. It is the occupation of a general store owner and the habit of a person who understands that memory is imprecise and paper is not. What the paper says is this: in 41 days of sustained cold, the basin lost 60% of its cattle. 3 homesteading families abandoned their claims entirely and came into Lewistown with what they could carry. Harold Pike, whose cabin was the best-built standard timber structure in the valley, burned through 4.5 cords of firewood and sent his eldest son twice to Lewistown for additional supply. The second trip, the boy's ears frosted on the ride back despite wrapping, and he lost the top of the left one. He was 16 years old. These are the numbers the winter produced. I set them here so that what comes next has its proper weight. On the 8th day of the -45 cold, the 3rd of January by my record, Dorothy McAllister dressed her 5 children in every piece of warm clothing the cabin contained, wrapped the youngest, who was not yet 2, inside her own coat against her body, and walked 4 miles across open ground to Marta Lindqvist's door. Thomas had gone out 3 days earlier to bring in the last of their wood and had slipped on the frozen ground near the woodpile, falling badly enough that he could not walk without assistance. He could not carry wood. The woodpile was 30 yards from the cabin door. The temperature was -45 °C. Dorothy had made the calculations she needed to make and arrived at the only answer available to her. She did not knock. Her hands, by the time she reached the door, could not form a fist. She pushed the outer door open with her shoulder, stepped into the vestibule, pulled it shut behind her. Then she pushed open the inner door. The warmth did not rush out to meet her the way warmth does from a room with a roaring fire. It simply existed, steady, present, undemonstrative. 14 degrees Celsius. The firebox held a single log, burning low. The gray-blue clay walls absorbed the tallow light and gave nothing dramatic back. Marta was at the table. She looked up. She did not appear surprised. Dorothy set the youngest child down on the stone floor. Then she stood in the middle of that small, low-ceilinged space and wept, not with relief, not with gratitude, but with the specific, involuntary physical response of hands that have been at -45 for 4 miles and have just been told they are allowed to be warm again. It is not an emotional experience precisely. It is a bodily one. Her hands hurt considerably more inside that room than they had outside it, which is the cruel arithmetic of thawing, and she cried because of that, and then she stopped and helped the children out of their outer layers and did not mention it again. She told me this herself 3 years later, with the matter-of-fact precision that characterized everything Dorothy McAllister described. She was not a woman who softened her own experience for the comfort of her listener. I have always respected that. They stayed 8 days. In 8 days, with 6 people in a space built for one, in the coldest sustained cold in the recorded history of Judith Basin, Marta Lindqvist burned 1/3 of a cord of firewood. When the temperature finally began to lift in the second week of January, she had more than half a cord remaining. Harold Pike, 2 people, the best standard timber cabin in the valley, 4.5 cords, and a boy with part of an ear gone. I will not editorialize on those numbers. I did not editorialize when Whitfield read them, and I will not now. Numbers of that character do their own speaking. The cold broke slowly and without apology, the way it had arrived. By the last week of January, people were moving again, taking stock, beginning the particular grim accounting that follows a hard season. The cattle losses were still being tallied. The homesteaders who had abandoned their claims were in town, some of them deciding whether to go back. Harold Pike came into my store on the 28th of January. He bought coffee and stood at the counter to drink it, which was not his usual habit. He was generally a man who took his purchases and left. We spoke for a while about the losses in the basin, about which families had come through and which had not. The ordinary cataloging of aftermath that communities do because it is necessary and because it gives the hands something to hold while the mind works through what has happened. After a while he set his cup down. He said, "I'm going to ride out to the Lindqvist place." I said that I imagined Marta would be glad of a visitor. He looked at me in a way that suggested a visitor was not precisely what he intended to be. He bought a second cup of coffee, paid for it, and left. He was gone most of the morning. When he came back through town, he did not stop. I watched him ride past from the window, straight-backed, unhurried, looking at nothing in particular. The face of a man who has been somewhere and seen something and has not yet decided what to do with it. 3 weeks later, a young couple named Brennan contracted him for a homestead cabin on the north end of the basin. I know this because they came into my store for supplies the following week and mentioned, in passing, that Pike had suggested they consider banking earth against the north and west walls of the new structure for what he called thermal stability. He had said it reduced fuel consumption significantly in hard winters. He had not said where he learned that. I stood behind my counter and listened to the Brennans describe Harold Pike's recommendation, and I felt something move through me that I could not then, and cannot now, put a precise name to. Not anger, not quite. Something more patient than anger, the feeling of a person who has been keeping a particular account for a long time and has just seen a number added to it that she knew was coming. I sold the Brennans their supplies. I said that Pike's recommendation was a sound one. I did not say anything else. Marta stayed on the land until 1894. 8 years, 4 more winters in the Jordkellera, 4 more springs in the structure above ground that she eventually built for the warmer months. She sold to a family from Iowa, good people by the account I received, and went to Minnesota to live with her daughter. I do not know what she told her daughter about what she had built. I do not know whether she described it in technical terms or in her father's terms or not at all. I do not know whether she spoke about that winter in the way that people speak about something they are proud of or in the way they speak about something they would prefer to set down and not carry anymore. I do not know when she died. This is the thing that sits most heavily with me of everything in this account. I know the dates of Eric's death, of the cold, of Pike's recommendation to the Brennans. I do not know the date of Marta Lindqvist's death because no one thought to tell me, and I did not know to ask. By 1891, 12 structures in Judith Basin used some form of earth-berming or thermal mass integration. People called it building smart, or they called it building the Montana way, or they said nothing at all and simply built it because it worked and because the man who contracted their cabin had suggested it. Her name was not attached to any of them. Whitfield had stopped writing at some point while I was talking. I noticed this only when I finished and looked at him and saw that his pen was resting on the table and he was watching me with an expression I had not expected on a government engineer, attentive and somewhat still, the way a person looks when they have heard something they intend to keep. I said, "Did you get the name?" He said, "Lindqvist." "Yes." I said, "Spell it back to me." He did, correctly. I said, "That is the first time anyone from the government has written that name in connection with what she built. That is 25 years. He looked at what he had written. Then he picked up his pen and wrote something additional beneath it. I could not see what from where I stood. I refilled his coffee. I turned back to the shelves and began straightening a row of tins that did not particularly need straightening because my hands required occupation and the conversation was finished. He sat for a while longer. Then he gathered his notebook and his coat and thanked me, and I heard the door open and close and the bell above it ring once, and then it was quiet. Outside, the April light was doing what April light does in Judith Basin, coming in at an angle that was warmer than October, but still honest, still showing the land as it was rather than as it would become. The cottonwoods along the creek were beginning faintly to green. 6 feet below the floor of this store, below the frost line, below everything the winter had reached, and the spring was now slowly reclaiming, the earth held its temperature, 9 degrees. As it had held it the winter, Marta Lindqvist pressed her palm against a clay wall and understood that her father had given her something worth keeping, as it was holding it now, as it would hold it long after Whitfield's report was filed, and I was gone, and the last person who remembered her name had followed her into whatever ground was waiting. The earth does not forget warmth, her father said that. She remembered it. I wrote it down.